So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining the talk today. Thanks to Anthony and the QA Babble Meetup organisation team as well for organising this. I think the size and the variety of the topics at this meetup are really impressive. So having a look at through some of the recordings before this, and it's a really great community that you've got here, and I'm really happy to be presenting to everyone here today. So today I'm going to be speaking about what I perceive to be the value of testers in DevOps. And it's a very far-reaching and open topic, but I'm going to be sharing my own experiences during this talk. So to give this talk some context, I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit about myself. My name's Ali Hill, and I live up in Edinburgh in Scotland. I started off in the tech industry as a video games tester in January 2014, before moving into a more traditional agile testing role a couple of years later. I then take a slight change of direction in my career by joining ECS as a delivery or DevOps consultant in 2018. And despite moving into more of a development or DevOps role, I still maintain a huge interest in testing as a discipline, as a craft, and I like to apply all the techniques I'm going to discuss today in my day-to-day work. I'm also active in the online tech and testing community, and you can find my Twitter handle on most of these slides. And feel free to message me if you've got any questions or points you want to make about the stuff that I'm sharing today. And I also want to give a shout out to a session that we've got running at ECS on Friday at 12 p.m. We're doing a QA and DevOps Ask Me Anything session on YouTube. So if you find the ECS YouTube or if you find me on Twitter, you'll find more details about that event. I'm going to be part of that panel answering any questions that you've got about QA and DevOps. So what am I going to be sharing with everyone today? First of all, I want to say that testers play a key role when it comes to the early stages of the development process. DevOps practices facilitate the acceleration of releases, but in order to provide value, we need to ensure that the team has a shared understanding of what it is we're developing and the value that this is providing to our customers. Testers can play a key role in this by asking the right questions and by using examples. Secondly, continuous testing is not all about automating tests. Test automation is critical in a DevOps environment, but as testers, we can test continually all throughout the development process and even after release. Lastly, and probably the most important point to work in any team in modern technology just now, is that collaboration is critical. Previously, testing would be the sole responsibility of the tester, and it would be left towards the end of the development process. But as we all know, this should no longer be the case if the team wants to find issues early and release quality software. Although I do go on to talk about automation in this talk, it's more about the practices associated with it rather than talking about the technology and tools themselves. And I've purposely focused this talk on the collaborative practices and process improvements that we can influence as testers. And that's where I've seen most of the benefit to have been throughout my career. And it's these practices that then allow you to use the tools and technology to facilitate you continuously improving processes within your team. But the mindset and this approach have to come first. But if you do want to dive deeper into the tools and technologies, then I think it was Tom McCrawley who gave a great talk called Testing Without the Safety Net at a previous QA Babble meetup. And that's now available on YouTube. I would definitely recommend watching that if you're interested in the tools and technology that may follow on from this talk. So why do I believe it's so important to share these thoughts on the value that testers can provide in DevOps environments? Like many roles in the technology industry, testing has changed over the past few years. Previously, testing was a role and activity that took place separate from other activities and within a separate team or department. Developers would take requirements, work on those requirements, throw that work over the wall to testers, who would then either throw the work back with bugs or throw it over to an operations team who may have never seen this code or known anything about this functionality before. Then companies obviously moved from waterfall into a more agile way of working, where teams were cross-functional. Testers, product owners, and developers would work together within the same team in typically short sprints. So in practice, this should remove silos. Everyone's working together to gain a shared understanding of the work. However, after having worked in a couple of companies working in agile and DevOps environments, I'm not totally convinced that we are taking full advantage of this situation where everyone's in the same team, I'm not totally convinced that silos have been removed. Are we really taking full advantage of the opportunities that Agile and DevOps environments provide us? Are we ensuring that there's a full understanding of what we're going to be developing by working through examples with the entire team? Are we working in collaboration with developers to give early insight into what tests we'll be running on this feature? Are we, as testers, getting involved as early as possible in the development process? Or are we waiting until the second week of a 2-week sprint to begin testing? And are we using new technologies and tools to aid our testing efforts? So quite a lot of what I'm going to talk about doesn't just apply to testers. It applies to everyone within an Agile or DevOps team. But what I'm sharing today is where I've provided value or where I've seen value being provided by testers working in DevOps environments. But I believe that the majority of what I'm going to be sharing today can be applied to pretty much any working environment. So I want to begin by covering the definition of continuous testing. It's mentioned a lot in books such as Accelerate and other DevOps texts. And when you search the term continuous testing online, the first non-advert result was this quote here, which states that continuous testing is a process of executing automated tests as part of the software delivery pipeline in order to obtain feedback on the business risks associated with a software release candidate as rapidly as possible. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but when you dissect it, this is talking about test automation. And I've taken this from the Tricentis website because this was the first result, but this definition is commonly adopted across the industry. So I don't disagree with anything that is actually said in this text, but what I do disagree with is using this text as a definition of continuous testing. For me, it's far too narrow. What about the discussions we have when we're planning and discussing new functionality? Are we not testing people's assumptions or understanding of the work that we're about to start working on? And what about after our work is released? Are we not using monitoring tools to test that our hypothesis was correct when we began the work, when we decided what value we were providing to the customer? I think it's potentially dangerous to describe continuous testing as purely automation. But instead of trying to come up with my own definition, because I don't think it would go well, I want to share this graphic, which most of you have probably seen before, from Dan Ashby. So this graphic's been shared at almost every conference I've been to over the past few years, every testing conference, since Dan first published it in 2016. But I think it's been shared for very good reason. And I want to talk a bit about why it is so important to me. So whilst I was drawing out my mind map for this talk and writing down my notes to plan the talk, I realized that I've been using this graphic as a visual aid to guide my work. It's not always been there in front of me, but it's always at least been at the back of my mind. And if we were to focus on the previous definition of continuous testing, we would maybe cover a quarter of this DevOps loop on the left-hand side. But what about the planning, releasing, the operations, and the monitoring side of the DevOps loop? And this is where I think the definition of continuous testing as automated testing of the release candidate falls short. As a tester in a DevOps environment, I want to be thinking about where I can add value at every stage of the development process. Traditionally, testing may fall into the build stage of the DevOps loop down at the bottom left-hand side there, but we should be looking to expand into other areas. And in order to do this, we need to collaborate with our teammates in other roles and learn new tools, technologies, and practices in order to provide most value. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk discussing the ways in which I have done that, or I have seen this done, and the value it can provide to your team. First, collaboration is key. If you're not willing to collaborate with other team members or other roles, then you're a living anti-pattern in an Agile or a DevOps environment. And this goes for everyone in any role in these sorts of teams. The different background and views that different roles provide to teams is extremely valuable, and it's one of your team's biggest assets. And as I begin to discuss the value that testers can provide in DevOps environments, they all have the same one key theme running through them, and that is one of collaboration. Gone are the days that testers should be exclusively sitting writing automated tests against requirements or exploratory testing a new piece of functionality by themselves in isolation. This does remain part of our roles and teams, of course it does, but we can provide a lot of value both before and after this stage, but not without collaborating with others. So first of all, when it comes to building requirements, it's important that we know what it is we're building and why. What problem are we trying to solve for the customer with this new piece of functionality? Without understanding why we're building something, it's impossible to begin answering how. How are we going to design this and how are we going to test this? You should be interested in the problem it is you're going to solve and the value you're potentially going to provide the customer. And of course, these questions are best asked at a Three Amigos session. We've got a product person, a tester, and a developer all present. And by understanding the problem that you're trying to solve and why, you can begin to use examples to try and find any missing requirements and to form a shared understanding across the whole team. Think of some examples of the functionality that you're talking about. If you're designing a password reset functionality, for example, then the main path is to allow users to reset their password. But then you can think of examples such as, can the user reset their password using a previously used password? Is there a limit to the number of times a user can reset their password within a single day or a set time period? And these examples may spawn off into different tasks or pieces of functionality. But by having these conversations up front, you're ensuring that the team is gaining a shared understanding. You can, of course, do this formally using sessions such as example mapping. But I've found in my experience, if your team isn't familiar with sessions such as example mapping, then starting small works best. It's sometimes not the best to jump into facilitated sessions for new practices, but obviously it totally depends on your team, your experience, and their experience. But the main benefit here is that if your team understands the benefit of talking through examples and discovering maybe edge cases that the team hadn't thought of, then you're on to a winner. And now that you've got a shared understanding of the functionality that you want to develop, you can start to talk about test scenarios with your team. Using our previous example, if you're designing a password reset system and the product owner decides that you can't use one of your previous 5 passwords when resetting the password, then that becomes a test for at least one layer of the application. Think about what other tests you plan on writing. Have you got any boundary examples that you can share with your team? And the value of sharing these tests that you want to run is that it reduces the likelihood of unexpected bugs being raised further down the pipeline. If you can say to your team that I plan on running these tests and these are my expected results, then you are ensuring that everyone knows what it is you're looking for in the behavior of the functionality. Of course, the team doesn't have to agree with you. If the product owner or developer disagrees with your expected results, then that's absolutely fine. But it gives you an opportunity to have these conversations as early as possible so that you're reducing waste. Say, for example, these conversations happen after your code is deployed to your test environment and your automated tests are run, then you're having to do a lot of rework to get back to the stage where we begin the deployment process over again. When we begin to build functionality, we're setting out to solve a problem for our customers. But how do we know that what we have developed is a success? We should be using data to either prove or disprove the hypothesis that we had when we started setting out to solve a problem. Is the functionality that we've developed being used when it's deployed to production? Are customers dropping off halfway through our expected user flow? If they are, is this due to an error? Are we catching and alerting the team on these exceptions? These are just a few of the questions we can ask ourselves when it comes to building requirements and designing our functionality. So none of what I'm saying here are new concepts, but I think it's amazing the value that these discussions provide. And it's not unique to DevOps either, but in my experience, it is important that these sessions are run in a DevOps environment because you're trying to release frequently. You're trying to accelerate shipping quality software. So the more effort you put into understanding requirements, the less rework you'll have to do. And sometimes things as simple as using examples and gaining a shared understanding of what you're developing can accelerate the rate at which you can develop this quality software. So I want to talk about TDD. And TDD is often seen as a developer's activity. It's something that they do when they're developing code. And it isn't something that I've seen most testers getting involved in. But based on my experience, this is a massive opportunity lost. I think it's important to state up front that TDD is a design activity. The tests that are written during the TDD process are used to guide a developer's implementation, and it also guides how they construct their code. But where does the information for which tests to write come from? The tests that are being written should be informed from the requirements that you had previously discussed with your team. I found it extremely valuable as a tester to work with developers as they practice TDD, and there are a couple of benefits to this. Firstly, it's a great opportunity to reinforce the understanding of the requirements that you and your team have. If you're sitting with a developer and they're writing unit tests, as a tester, you should be able to identify why they're writing those specific tests. Keep the requirements handy as you're pairing with them, and refer to them often. And I know that when I wear my developer hat, when I'm working as a developer, I often look at the requirements frequently and have them in my code as comments to ensure that I'm testing the intended behavior of the system, whilst also testing the way I'm implementing my code. And from experience, I know it's easy for developers to lose discipline when practicing TDD and get caught up in implementing something that barely resembles the requirements just to get my test to pass. So that's why I find it so valuable when practicing TDD, and it's where I see the value of testers getting involved. I find that as testers, we're great at keeping a focus on the customer and the requirements, whilst the developer we're working can often get lost in the code. So also has a second benefit. Whilst the developer's practicing TDD, you can talk about the testability of the code under development. Of course, practicing TDD means that the developer's code should be testable at least at a unit level. But if you have discussed some UI or API tests that you would like to write for this, then this provides the opportunity to implement exception handling, talk about expected response formatting, and talk about putting hooks into the code for UI automated testing. It's the perfect opportunity to develop with testability in mind. And if you're the one that's going to be writing these automated tests, then you know exactly what to hook into, and you can begin writing these tests right away. And if it's a developer that's writing these tests further down the process, then they're creating a testable implementation for themselves, and they're less likely to grow frustrated with writing automated tests. As well as this, are you developing observable functionality? What login are you implementing? Are you talking about what trace you need if a user's following a specific flow? If something goes wrong in production, how are you going to know? It's easy to trace a user's journey from end to end. And it's implementation here that makes life a lot easier after your functionality is released to production. You can observe what is going on in your system. So it's important to talk about logging and monitoring at this stage. So of course, one of the main advantages of TDD is that you end up with a large suite of tests that can be run every time code is committed, and making sure that we aren't breaking builds. But typically what you'll find with unit tests is that they test the expected flow, the expected implementation. But what about the edge or the boundary cases? If we refer back to the reset password example, what if someone were to reuse their 5th most recent password? It shouldn't be allowed based on our specification, but has our code handled an off by 1 error? If it's correctly not allowed, then are the correct exceptions being thrown? It's these type of scenarios where I believe that testers can add a lot of value in TDD or with writing unit tests. And why wait until a build has been deployed to a test environment to catch issues like this? If a tester's involved at this stage, you'll generally find that cases like this are caught earlier, and it prevents rework further down the line. So earlier in this talk, I stated a disagreement with the way that continuous testing is defined by much of the industry. And one of my complaints was that the scope was too narrow. And I fully believe that if I'd said this on Twitter or online, then I may have been pulled up for devaluing automated testing. But I don't think by promoting the value of testers and DevOps out with test automation, I'm definitely not saying that automation isn't valuable. In my team, we've found out recently the pain of not having enough automated tests and relying too much on human testing after deploying. Of course, most automated tests only highlight what has changed. You provide an expected response and you compare it to an actual response, and it tells you if what is returned matches what is expected. And tests like this are basic, but there is much as part of testing and as valuable for me as exploratory testing is. In a complex system with many moving parts, components, or modules, it could be foolish to assume that changes to one component will not interfere with the functionality elsewhere. We've made changes in our team recently that have led to unexpected functional changes out with the area that we were directly working on. And a simple automated expected result versus actual result, a test like that would have caught this for us instantly and saved our customers from experiencing issues. So in order to have an effective test suite that provides value to the team, we should focus on what the biggest risks are to the business and to the customer. If a test fails, we want it to mean something to the team. And this is the same if a test passes. We want the team to feel confident that nothing major has broken. If a major issue occurs in production that we didn't have tests for, then we should be looking to add tests that cover this scenario so that we'll find out about it quicker next time. The entire team should feel responsible for our automated tests, from unit tests all the way to end-to-end tests. As I mentioned previously, I would encourage testers to share knowledge of the tests they're planning on writing or running with the rest of the team. It also doesn't have to be testers that write these tests. Everyone should be familiar with this test code repository, so encourage developers to add some tests into the suite themselves after discussing the types of tests that you would like to run. In our team just now, we have one person who owns a task from beginning to the end of development, and this includes writing their own automated tests and testing their own functionality. But like I said, we encourage collaboration. So like I've spoken about with coming up with test ideas as a team before we begin work. And this collaboration gives us confidence that when developers are writing tests for their own code, they're doing so with the requirements in mind and not just to test that their own implementation works. So speaking from experience, don't leave the setting up of test environments and test data as an afterthought. There's nothing more frustrating than not being able to reliably run your tests or failures happening due to problems in that environment. This again comes under testability. You should be able to create what you need when you need it, or at the very least have it available to you at set times. And I would encourage you to consider this as early in the project as possible. One of the pain points our team's experiencing just now is that we're trying to work backwards and implement the ability to deploy small components of our code at a time to run tests quickly and get fast feedback. But the way we've designed the code is that we've basically created a number of dependencies that make this difficult to do. We haven't considered testability of our environments until much later in the process, although we have developed our code with testability in mind. If you have tests that take 15 minutes to run in your CI/CD pipeline, then there's a big chance that the developer who deployed the code is going to start working on something else while they're waiting on their test results. And this can result in context switching from that developer, which is a waste. For me, this comes back down to only writing and running critical tests every time code is committed. Of course, there are ways to speed up your tests in the code itself, such as running them in parallel, but some tests do just take a long time to run. And I would consider running these nightly so that developers can deploy code and get results back within a couple of minutes. This prevents the team from being frustrated with their automated tests and the impact it is having on their processes. Also, one of the things that I've found most recently is be prepared to adapt to new testing practices. For example, infrastructure as code. In our team just now, we're heavy users of Terraform, which deploys our infrastructure, such as virtual machines, to AWS. And I've never tested Terraform code before, so this was completely new to me. Terraform is written as a declarative language, and we found that testing it at a unit level is difficult. but it can become just as complex as any other programming language such as Python or Java when you use it in big projects. So what we did was we created our own test framework within the team, and we write tests that run after our infrastructure has been deployed to AWS to ensure that it is configured correctly. Although the language in Terraform is declarative, you can pull in modules from other infrastructure that can have an impact on what you're deploying. And the tests that we've written are really quick, under a second, and they're inexpensive. We're using Python and Boto3, which is the AWS API. And that allows us to be confident that we haven't adversely affected the infrastructure that we wish to deploy by working somewhere else. So exploratory testing is a technique that much of the DevOps and tech industry don't know much about. The ability to explore a piece of software or functionality to discover unknowns. These are the types of tests that we can't automate, and because we don't know what the expected behavior is a lot of the time. It's how we learn more about our complex systems, and it's potentially one of the most underrated skills that a software tester possesses. But in the world of continuous deployments and accelerated releases, does exploratory testing still have a place? Very much so, I believe. I believe it fits in a different way. And as testers, we need to change the scope of what it is we're exploring and how we're carrying it out. But there's definitely still a place for exploring a more mature version of the product, such as in our test environment or in production. But the more frequently this is done at the earlier stages, the better. Consider a couple of slides before this where I spoke about testers getting involved in TDD. You can begin to explore the software at that unit layer before it is deployed. You don't necessarily need to be code confident in order to carry this out. Think about what it is you'd like to explore with a new piece of functionality or the system as a whole, and work with a developer on writing that test. See if it's possible to capture all or some of these scenarios for your exploration in unit tests. Basic unit tests are relatively simple, but if you're dealing with a complex system, then you can create unit tests that span multiple functions within your code. Exploring at this layer can be extremely valuable to teams. You're still testing at the code level, but you're spanning multiple, often complex functions and logic. And in the interest of getting other team members involved, set up a session with your team to explore the system on the test environment. Many minds and different backgrounds and roles are more powerful than one. Time box this session and have set goals of what you like to explore and with what tools. And this gives you the opportunity to show the benefits of exploratory testing and discuss what you have discovered after the session is finished. I've run this in my last company, and I've seen it eventually lead to a change in mindset from developers, which often leads to them considering outside of the happy path in order to uncover more information. And they do this naturally as they're developing. So it often takes place on their local machines as they deploy what they've been working on or within their development environment. So this is why I've titled this slide as continuous exploration. Exploratory testing is important to uncover more information about the system. But in a world where we want to ship faster, we need to adapt to where it is taking place. By practicing some exploratory testing techniques at the unit level and getting developers involved, the team are practicing exploratory testing throughout the process as well as in the traditional manner. For me, in a DevOps environment, we are not finished with a piece of functionality until we have proven that it works in production. And by working, I mean there are no errors or exceptions. And once this has been proven and the functionality is in front of customers, we can begin to see how they're using it. So as I discussed before, observability needs to be discussed upfront. The login that we are outputting once the software is running in production, and the tracing of users' actions and data being sent through pipelines, for example, should be easy to do. We should be validating that what we have developed is being used by the customer the way that we would expect. As well as the product owner or the team getting feedback from customers directly, we can do this through various monitoring tools. And it's this data that allows us to prove whether our hypothesis, when we began gathering requirements, was correct or not. In the world of DevOps, it is most likely your team's responsibility to operate your own software. In our context, we deploy our functionality directly to AWS, and we mainly utilize Lambda functions. We have set up our Lambda functions to capture errors and then send email alerts to the team if these errors occur. So this allows us to act immediately if there are any problems with any of our functions. As well as this, we also monitor costs. And costs weren't something that I spoke about when we spoke about designing or gathering requirements, but it should definitely be considered at this stage. Operating in the cloud can lead to costs escalating quite rapidly, but you can combat this slightly by setting up billing alerts, either daily or as things spike beyond what you decide is an acceptable cost. And an unexpected cost alert can point to a problem within your functionality. For example, you may be suffering from an infinite loop, which is causing your function to run over and over, which is causing the cost to rise. And given the complex nature of most of the applications we work on now, testing in production is becoming a necessity for quite a lot of teams. We can set up test or staging environments to look as much as like production as possible, but each of these environments will always be unique due to data, the activity taking place at the same time, or even small differences in the way that it's configured. How many times have you seen a bug occur in production that didn't occur in your test environment? I know for me, the answer is quite a few times. And I know there are restrictions on accessing data in production, as there should be, but run as many different non-disruptive tests as possible in your production environment. You can start off by running health checks that ensure, for example, a basic GET on your APIs or REST endpoints is functioning as expected. The monitoring that I've just discussed should capture this as well. But start off by running these checks until your team feels more confident running tests in production, and make the results of these tests accessible to all so that everyone knows the health status of your production environment. So when I first joined ECS, I joined as a QA engineer, and I hadn't thought I'd be wearing as many hats or perform as many roles as I do now within a team. One day I can act as a developer, the next as an infrastructure engineer, and the next as a tester. I know that not all teams are as flexible as this, but I think it's really important that as testers in DevOps environments, we begin to get comfortable with some aspects of these roles. If we can get comfortable with monitoring tools, testing infrastructure, or pairing with developers on TDD, then we're stretching the definition of our role as a tester, but this is not a bad thing. And this should also work the other way. Other roles in the team should be aiming to learn more from you, and this is where you coaching developers on what you're going to test and why is important. It's a great way to start building a cross-functional team. If there is an issue in the production environment that needs debugging, for example, then offer to help. I found one of my biggest changes to working in a DevOps environment and a cross-functional team is that I rarely, if ever, say, that's not my job. If you haven't looked at the monitoring tool before, then offer to work with other members of your team to begin to get familiar with it, help to debug the issue. After a few times of doing this, you may feel comfortable to take the lead on the situation the next time. And this sort of transition to a cross-functional team, it takes a long time. I've been working on becoming more cross-functional whilst maintaining a focus on testing for over 4 years now at 2 different companies. But I'd suggest starting small. Pair now and again as a developer is writing unit tests. Invite the team to perform a monthly exploratory testing session. Talk about testing requirements at a meeting. And you might be surprised the impact that you can have in such a small space of time. Testing in DevOps, for me anyway, has been about adapting to a lot of new technologies and tools. For example, when it came to testing infrastructure as code, I was totally out of my comfort zone. But it's about applying the same principles that you know well. For example, if you know how to organize test automation, if you know how to exploratory test a UI, you can apply these techniques to new technologies. And it's also about adapting your processes to reduce waste further down the process. In DevOps environments, we've never had a better opportunity to work closer with different roles on a day-to-day basis. We can continue to learn from each other to improve our processes. For example, by collaborating on TDD and generating test ideas throughout that process. As testers, we need to be able to celebrate what we're good at. For example, like I mentioned, exploratory testing. But we also need to adapt to bring these new skills to a new way of working. So in summary, what value can you provide as a tester in a DevOps environment? I've spoken about getting involved in the development process as early as possible. And this is the key point for me. I've seen so many bugs being caught in a test environment that could have been prevented by talking about different scenarios or examples with your team. Of course, you're not going to prevent all the bugs from making it into code, but the importance of having a shared understanding of requirements and test scenarios cannot be understated. There's a lot more to testing in DevOps than automating tests. Yes, that plays a critical role that I don't want to downplay, but even more important than automation is the collaboration aspect and working with multiple roles within your team. Break down those walls between roles and begin to blur the lines. This helps prevent bottlenecks within your team as people begin to become more cross-functional. Finally, we need to learn and adapt in this new role. DevOps environments provide us with the perfect opportunities to expand our knowledge and skills, but also the opportunity to share our knowledge and skills with other members of the team. Working closer with developers on TDD and monitoring, but also pairing with them on writing automated tests that used to be your responsibility, or even running through test scenarios can be extremely valuable. If nothing else, it builds a sense of empathy within the team where you understand each other's roles better. So thank you very much for listening to my talk this afternoon on the value of testers in DevOps. We've got time for questions now, but if you want to discuss anything outside this session, then feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. You can see my handle here, or on LinkedIn. And I'd also appreciate feedback on the talk itself. This is the first time I've given this talk, so if you've got any feedback, constructive or positive, then please feel free to let me know. I'd be happy to hear it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali. That's really appreciate it. I think a great topic. More and more these days, some of the GC roles that I see are asking for people exposure to DevOps. So yeah, some great points there. As always, great talk, generated some great questions. So I'll get through as many of these as possible, guys. Thank you so much for them. So first question comes from Ian. He says, if testing is the art of challenging assumptions at any stage of a delivery, then is that a specialist analyst skill set or a designated role within a team that can be done by anyone, and the success of that depends on the more general skill set of the person's undertaking that role?
So I think generally, based on the traditional roles we've had, sorry if I don't answer this question correctly, but based on the traditional role that we've come from, where we do as testers, we are good at challenging assumptions. We probably provide most value in that just now in our current roles, but I do believe it can be done by anyone with the right sort of coaching, the right sort of training. And this is why I talk about exposure to your mindset. You're basically trying to share with people how you're thinking and what you're planning on doing as you design new functionality. So I do believe that anyone could be, like, we've learned these skills ourselves throughout performing this role. So I do believe that pretty much anyone can learn to challenge assumptions like we do. But it definitely takes a lot of effort and time to get to that point where people are as effective as challenging assumptions as we are as testers. I hope that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Ali. Next question comes from Miriam. They say, I'm a manual tester and use Zephyr for my manual test scripts. I want to know how DevOps can be better than Zephyr for testing management activities.
So I've never actually used, is it Zephyr? Zephyr?
Yeah, Zephyr, sorry.
Is that a test management tool?
I've not come across that one before.
No. So what I can give a general answer about tools themselves. So I found a lot of places, a lot of teams focus on the tools rather than what they're doing within their processes. The tool should be there to aid what your process is. So, for example, if you're wanting to, I don't know, set up a Jira Kanban board or raise bugs, then your process should drive the way that your board or your test management tool looks. So, for example, if you're wanting to get developers involved in writing test automation, you wouldn't necessarily have all the test automation tasks automatically assigned to the tester, if that makes sense. You would allow people to pick that up from the top of the backlog as it comes in, and if they don't feel comfortable picking that up, then you could ask why not and work on it together. So it's important that the tools are there to help you organize what you're doing, but they don't drive the process. You drive the process and then use the tools to assist you. I don't know if that answers the question about the Zephyr
Seems
tool.
to have,
I've not
yeah.
used it.
Next question comes from Sam. He says, Ali, you mentioned about unit testing a lot. Could that be better termed as contract testing? Since I still believe the very minute unit tests should be part of development work. You'd also like to hear your thoughts on how integration and presentation layer tests fit into the pipeline.
Okay. So from what I understand, contract, I don't believe that unit testing is the same as contract testing. When I was talking about unit testing in this context, I was talking about using it as TDD. Writing unit tests as part of TDD. So you're using the test to guide your implementation. And those tests can be run as anyone else comes in and makes a change on that piece of code. But also you can add, like I was saying, you can add more scenarios like boundary examples that we would add as testers. Contract testing, I believe, is not something I'm an expert in. In fact, I only just got exposed to it a couple of months ago. It's more about how, if teams are using different APIs, then it's about not breaking that contract so like if someone changes something to the API, that could break functionality for a team that's consuming that API. I'm not sure how you would implement that at the unit testing layer. I would be happy to speak about that after. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry about the integration.
Yeah, bear me a second. Scroll back here. Some would also like to hear your thoughts on how integration and presentation layer tests fit into the pipeline.
So the only sort of integration tests that we've written before have been sort of APIs talking to databases, for example. I'm not sure about if we talk about the presentation layer, the UI tests, then that I can answer that. So what we would do is, as soon as something is deployed to an environment, we would have our infrastructure tests running. So like the Terraform test that I mentioned before. We would then have our integration tests, such as like APIs or database tests, how the APIs interact with the database. We would have them running immediately after. We found it a lot easier to get them to a shorter time than the UI test, for example. So we don't have UI or presentation layer tests. We've got, because all of our work is done in AWS, we don't really have a front end in the team just now. But these tests take a long time because you're essentially deploying something, changing the state in AWS, waiting on AWS to pick it up. Because if you trigger it manually, you hit a throttling limit. And it's those tests that take a long time. So what I'd suggest in our team is that we have the integration tests, which take a second each or something to run in our pipeline every time the code's deployed. But the end-to-end tests, we have them running on a nightly basis because they do take a long time, and we've not figured out a way to shorten that time yet. You'd maybe want one or two critical end-to-end tests running. It depends on what the team agrees, but I find that anything longer than 5 minutes for a pipeline to run, people get distracted, and it doesn't have the same impact.
Awesome, thank you. Next question comes from Marie Cruz. Feature flags have allowed us to test our features in production safely. However, I attended a talk before where the speaker discourages the use of feature flags since this increases the complexity of your tests. What are your views on feature flags?
I'll be honest, I've never, even though I'm talking about testing and DevOps, I've never actually used them. But from what I understand, I can see the value in them, definitely, because if you're much better to run your tests in a production environment, especially if you're using feature flags to sort of protect the users, if you like, from any impact of your tests, because you're hiding it behind a feature flag essentially. I think what I would do if I was going to start using them was start the test small, try the non-intrusive test, try something really simple, like just first of all making sure that the code is there and it's deployed. How would you test for that? But I'm not sure how it would complicate your tests further, essentially. Sorry, I can't give an answer to that one.
Next one comes from Ian. He says, wait a second. What's the strategy for retooling team members to be able to wear different hats that the company can buy into paying for? Example, bringing testers into code knowledge, developers into test analysis, left shift thinking, lateral thought.
So why would a company buy into it, essentially?
Yeah.
So this is always a difficult one. So it depends a lot on the culture of the team you're working in, first of all, and of the company you're working in. So we've always kind of done it, when I did it in my last place, when I've done it now, we've done it by stealth almost. So we've just decided that it would be a good idea for me to pair with a developer when they're writing their unit tests or when they're practicing TDD, or it would be a good idea for them to learn how to write automated tests. And I think we've shown the benefit of that. So in my last place, we used to have a Kanban board where all the testing tasks were assigned to me. And at the end of each sprint, I would still have loads of tasks in progress because there was 3 developers and there was only 1 of me. But after some time, when the developers became more comfortable and we became more comfortable as a team with other members writing tests or performing testing, we could share those tasks out. So it meant that more work was considered done. So if we're going to talk about using metrics, our velocity would have been our metric here. I know there's arguments about whether that's effective or not, but management seem to like it. So our velocity would have been increased because we were managing to get more tasks through, because we were sharing that responsibility of testing with the developers in the team. And I think it's about tracking as well. So not tracking how many bugs you've raised, but how many issues you encounter late on in the process. So like I was saying, a lot of bugs can be prevented. And if you know that you're having to do a lot of rework within a sprint on a particular piece of work, and you're finding that number reduces, then that's another good selling point there. That can be given to management as a benefit. But yeah, we've always started off by doing it in stealth. It's really hard to I've not found a perfect way of convincing managers to invest time in things like this, even though the team knows it makes sense. It definitely depends on the culture of the company.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so Indu says, what skills do you suggest to begin with to start getting involved within DevOps as a tester?
So I think one of the biggest ones for me is being code confident. And I don't necessarily mean being able to write code, because I know that's not for everyone and not something that everyone enjoys learning to do. But even just if you know a piece of functionality well, or you understand the requirements well, if you can spend time pairing with a developer who's writing the code and asking questions about it, you'll learn how to read code. Not at like not at a massively detailed level, but being able to understand basically at a high level, what the flow of the code is. And then you can begin to ask questions like, oh, what happens if a user does this? Or what happens if a user performs this action? Then they'll be able to show you the different paths, like the exceptions or the error reporting. You can ask them about login and things like that. So I think definitely it's not just for DevOps, but the biggest skill that I've picked up, I do write code now, but the biggest thing initially for me was becoming code confident and being able to read code and work with developers on that.
Brilliant. Okay. Other than that, mate, we've got loads of thanks. Everyone's really enjoyed the talk. Very, very insightful. Stephen Brown says, thanks, Ali. It was a good summary of the journey he's seen too. He's coached testers to go about their day job, always thinking, is what I'm doing now contributing to adding value to the customer? This removes the label of specific role, set of tasks you do. It also helps focus attention in the right place. So yeah, really, really good. Just make sure I've not missed anything. Ian says, yeah, totally agree. Complex e-commerce systems can make a lot more sense when you get to know the developer's design patterns. So yep, some really great stuff there. We're coming close to the end, guys, so we'll wrap this up now. Thank you, as always, for everyone that's attended today and making this online webinar success. Watch the space on the QA Babble page. I should be announcing the next talk. Got a conversation lined up this afternoon to get set up, but someone that's also known very well in the community. A lot of you will know I've heard of. Other than that, thank you very much, everyone. Stay safe, and if you want to follow up on anything afterwards, drop myself or Ali a message. Thank you very much again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.